I want to start with a couple of questions for you. In Act 1, we are often introduced to the essence of a main character by seeing their special skills in action. So, what are the special skills that have been revealed about the hero so far? What special skills do we see in action in Sequence 2? And of course, what special skills are you demonstrating about your main character in your Act 1? Selma's Sequence 2 starts at about 16 minutes into the movie. We see the opposing general, President Johnson, in the Oval Office meeting with a very creepy J. Edgar Hoover, who is one of the forces of opposition of this story. Johnson knows that King was assaulted in Selma, and he wants to know what King might be planning next. And Hoover says that there are ways to shut King down permanently, blatantly referring to the Kennedy assassination. And there's a nice bit of horrified ambiguity from Johnson as he says, "I'm aware of that." Instead, he agrees to Hoover's plan of driving a wedge into the marriage by using King's infidelity against him, which is another one of the opponent's attack plans. We cut to the typed surveillance over a home scene of King and Coretta. Coretta gets a threatening phone call, which again reminds us of the stakes. King tells her he'll be leaving in the morning for Selma, which he calls an ideal staging ground. He expresses his worry about Sheriff Clark, and he repeats Orange's line, "Good a place to die as any." These stakes are life and death, and Coretta says that she doesn't want him to even joke about it. King then makes a private phone call to what we expect is going to be a lover, but instead it's singer Mahalia Jackson. He asks her to sing to give him strength for the battle, which is a great character reveal. And the typed surveillance notes the call. Now, from what we've seen so far, it looks like President Johnson is King's main opponent, right? But as we've seen in the Hunger Games, in a dystopian story, the real opponent is the toxic society itself. So in Selma, the main opponent is the racism that American society is built on. And President Johnson is actually a character type that story guru John Truby calls the opponent ally. He continually opposes King at the same time that he has enormous sympathy for him. This ambivalent character is always an audience favorite because we're never sure what that character is going to do. And we just saw that used to good effect in the Hunger Games with Peeta. Then when Johnson finally chooses sides in that final battle, it's an exhilarating moment. So now we have another meeting the team sequence when King and his lieutenants gather at a safe house in Selma where a local activist is putting them up. The men joke around with each other, again showing their ordinariness. Team bonding like this is an important story element that we see especially in the first half of a story. Andrew Young takes us through some history by explaining the different civil rights organizations that are gathering there in Selma. And at night, while King works on a speech, Hosea Williams warns him that the students of SNCC are likely to be territorial. Then we see King giving a speech to a packed church of 700 people. He says, busing, segregation, voting rights, one struggle just seems to go on to another, but it's all one effort, an effort for their lives. Again, he brings up the sainted children who were killed in the church bombing, and he says that those children say to them, "It is unacceptable that 50% of Selma is Black, but only 2% of those people can vote." Which means we march, we demonstrate, we disturb the peace, we go to jail. This scene is a key element of war stories, rallying the troops. You can also call it an eve of battle speech with a rallying cry, "Give us the vote." And the whole church shouts with him, "Give us the vote." After the speech, we meet a New York Times journalist who has come to cover the protest. And he asks King a question that is one of the themes of the film. Are you truly nonviolent if you're trying to provoke violence? And King answers, "We will no longer allow them to use their billy clubs against us in dark alleys and the halls of power. We will force them to do it in the light of day." It's really important to state your themes aloud. Don't worry about going over the top, because you can always pull it back. During this exchange with the reporter, we also see King briefly shake the hands of Jimmy Lee, who tragically and ironically becomes the first soldier to fall in this conflict. So that's a bit of foreshadowing. In the next scene, we see those SNCC students, James Foreman and the great John Lewis. And this movie shows John Lewis becoming the civil rights leader that he was. We definitely see Foreman being territorial. This is conflict in the ranks. And then there's an interesting and important discussion of strategy. Registering people to vote and raising Black consciousness is fine, King says. It's a good strategy. But his core strategy is negotiate, demonstrate, and resist. And on their best days, the adversary helps by making a mistake. Explaining the battle strategy is a key story element for war stories, but I'd argue that it's an important element for any story. And a key component of this strategy, what they need to make their plan work, is what King calls a bull Connor. They need a racist lawman who will attack the protesters and draw media attention to the protest. This will build support for the cause by creating empathy for the peaceful protesters. They need drama, they need cameras, and they need to be on the front pages of the newspapers every morning to get Johnson's attention. So here King is spelling out his exact desire for the upcoming battle. And King asks John Lewis, "Is Sheriff Clark a bull Connor?" And John Lewis says yes. King also spells out exactly what we're going to see next in terms of the battle. They have a single battleground, the courthouse, and a clear avenue of approach to the battleground. A good war story is very careful to tell us exactly what we're going to see geographically so that we don't get confused in the heat of battle. And Gladiator is a great movie to watch for that. And then we cut to exactly that. Hundreds of peaceful protesters marching down this avenue toward the courthouse, toward the climactic Act 1 battle, past these hostile white townspeople and assembled journalists. And as they're marching, the camera cuts to each one of the key players, major and minor. This is a great suspense technique that I like to call place your bets. It invites the audience to think about and speculate who might be hurt or killed in this battle. And we see a great example of that in Act 1 of Jaws, on that beach scene when Sheriff Brody is looking at different people on the beach, including a dog, and we're wondering, okay, who's going to get killed here? So the opposing army, Sheriff Clark and his lawmen, are lined up on the courthouse steps. The protesters dramatically kneel all at once with their hands behind their heads. Clark orders them to disperse, and King commences to negotiate. They're there to access the registration office, which is their legal right. Clark tells them to go around to the back to wait. And King says that segregation is now illegal. They will wait in front. And Sheriff Clark is pissed. He and his cops begin to push through the crowd, ordering them to clear the sidewalk. And they focus on and start harassing Jimmy Lee's grandfather, who's unable to kneel because of arthritis. Jimmy Lee steps up to protect him, and Clark and the cops turn on Jimmy Lee. And then Annie Lee Cooper stands and hits Clark with her purse. And the cops violently throw Annie Lee to the ground. So this battle, the end of sequence 2, is also the climax of Act 1. And in the tag to the act, rabid racist Governor Wallace gives a pro-Confederacy speech while President Johnson listens on the radio in the Oval Office. An aide brings in the morning newspapers, which all have a front page photo of Annie Lee Cooper on the ground, injured, being menaced by white cops. So we know this has been an extremely successful campaign because we see the results exactly as King intended. We understand how effective it was because King's dialogue planted the idea of what results he wanted, and the payoff was seeing those exact results. It's also really useful to compare this big Act 1 battle scene to the much smaller one that was the battle scene in the climax of Sequence 1. The Sequence 1 battle scene was intimate, interior, it was in that hotel lobby, and it really was just one punch to the face. In Sequence 2, we see a protracted battle scene that builds to that bigger Act 1 climax. There's an assembly of the troops in the church. There's an eve of battle speech by General King. There's the dramatic march of hundreds of protesters through the town. And finally, the confrontation with the sheriff's troops at the courthouse.